I'd like to acknowledge Australia's First Nation people as the traditional custodians of the land, and for this episode in particular, the Peramang and Keona people. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
Well, an attribute of a great winemaker is you've got to have passion for it. You can't be half-hearted. You know, not everyone's got the same amount of ability, but you can't be half-hearted with your time and effort put into it, because it's something that doesn't just do itself.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Dan Redman is the fourth generation winemaker at Redman Wines. Redman stands as one of the founding estates of Coonawarra, boasting a rich history that is interwoven throughout the region. Dan is here to share how Redman has endured the test of time. Hi Dan, thanks for joining me.
Hi Shanteh, nice to have a chat.
Yeah, I think it's a little long overdue, and I'm thrilled to have you on the podcast. My father used to collect your wines, so they've had a very special place on the table for a long time. And your family history dates back quite a long way. So you've got a challenge ahead of you to give us a little bit of a rundown of your family history within the region, if you can do it.
It's probably a story I've told a few times. My great-grandfather, Bill Redman, he and his older brother arrived in Coonawarra in 1901, and Bill was 14, and they were looking for work. And Bill got a job in John Riddoch's Cellars, which is now the famed Wynns Gables building that's on the front of their label, and his older brother got put to work in the fields because Bill was quite small at 14. He'd come from a farming area about an hour's drive away now, but he was by train back in those days. And that was sort of the start of the Redman family's association with Coonawarra and making wine, and it sort of just fell into it. So then in 1908, he and his family bought a vineyard, and so the family's owned vineyard and made wine in Coonawarra since 1908. It's a bit of a hard one to fathom, isn't it? Just going around trying to find somewhere to work as a 14-year-old, right? Like, you know.
Oh my gosh, can you imagine these days if you tell your kid to go out and get a job at 14 and that they need to do all that hard yakka? I can't imagine that would fly very well.
Oh, I've got an 8-year-old, and trying to get him to play outside's hard enough, let alone, you know, try and do some work. So, you know, and they worked. He worked very hard, and my grandfather then sort of joined him, Owen, and for a long period, right up until the sort of 1930s or 40s, they were the only people making dry red wine in Coonawarra. And if you go back to Bill's own words, is that he said you could write failure across Coonawarra through that era. A lot of the grapes were fermented into wine and distilled into brandy. So it was a bit of a battling region. And I think when my grandfather came back, they started just sort of selling some wine to different places, and the wines that they made were always very good, to the extent that Tolly's in the 1914s or around that time stopped buying their wine because they said, no, people think your wine's too good and not buying our wine, so we're not buying it anymore. And so the history of making good wines out of the regions was there, and it just took, I guess, some outside investment from Penfolds and Mildara and Lindemans in the sort of 40s and 50s that really, really kicked things off.
Wow. So paint a picture for us a little bit just in reference to that. The region was producing grapes, but brandy was for export. That's where, you know, the demand was for?
I think, good question. I think the brandy would have been a local supply brandy, but there was not a huge amount of dry red wine drank in the region. So it was there was obviously a demand for brandy around the area. So it really just wasn't the demand there. And then I guess, you know, coming from a working class background, they weren't marketers, and they weren't wealthy doctors or lawyers who wanted to replicate Bordeaux or Burgundy wherever they are. So, you know, it took them a while to sort of, I guess, work out the nuts and bolts of the industry, and that was sort of via entering wine shows and getting Coonawarra a bit of recognition that way.
When you think back that long time ago and you think about, some of these big names that you're throwing around, back then there wasn't a huge amount of community in terms of, 6 different cellar doors next to one another. So was the community kind of small? Did people making wine talk to one another and throw ideas and talk about what they were doing?
Oh, if you go back into that era, there was only really the Wynns Winery, or what's now known as the Wynns Winery, and the winery that Bill and Grandpa had built, which was Rouge Homme. So, and that label didn't even start until the early 50s. But it was, I remember, the story is that Grandpa entered some wines up in Adelaide and at the wine show, and it won first prize. And they're like, oh, this is, this one's from Coonawarra. Who's brought this wine? And, Grandpa's standing in the corner and sort of puts his hand up, and most of the people didn't have a clue who he was or where Coonawarra was. So it was sort of through that era that, it took a bit of work, a bit of legwork to sort of create a name. And I guess then it really was in the 50s when David and Samuel Wynne, wine merchants from Melbourne, came and bought the rundown John Riddoch cellars and sort of really transformed the area. And that was also at the same time that Mildara and Penfolds and Lindemans and other wine making names were really sort of starting to invest in the area. But it was very small, Shanteh. Like it was tiny. There wasn't a lot of grapes. It was started off as a fruit colony, so there was lots of peach trees and apples and pears, and there was still some vines, and there still are some old vines around. But it wasn't a huge industry.
Wow. I wonder, what if you could tell them today what Coonawarra means to Australian wine and fast forward, I bet, a bit like Back to the Future, they would scarcely believe it. But tell me a little bit about William Wilson, because when you look back into the history of Coonawarra, these names are intertwined, and I think that that's quite a fascinating part of the history too.
Yeah, William Wilson was a Scotsman, born in Fife in Scotland, and he was a budding horticulturalist, and had gone to war and been to different places, including Greece, and somehow ended up back in Coonawarra in Penola, and he had some amazing stories. He went over to the Ballarat goldfields, and he and another guy got all this gold, and they were going back to Penola the next day, and he woke up in the morning and his partner had stolen all his gold and run off, and so he had to go back to the fields and keep mining for some golds. But he started a veggie patch essentially, and some trees and orchards and things, and it did extremely well, and that led to John Riddoch, who was a wealthy Scotsman, saying, why is this growing so well, and why are you sort of so renowned in the area for your fruit and veg? And he said, it's the climate and the soil, and that led to John Riddoch getting a couple of gentlemen down from Adelaide Uni to sort of do some research, and which led to the founding of the Coonawarra Fruit Colony back in the 1890s.
So cool. I mean, when you think about it, you really have to kind of transport yourself, because this is not talking about a little hobby farm where someone's like, oh, hey, that person's got some nice herbs. This is their life, this is what they lived off. If you could grow it, you could eat. And essentially, that was what they were there to do, was to make a living and to be able to be viable as human beings, right?
Yeah. It's I guess that's just transporting yourself back to that era. There's a if you ever visit Penola and Coonawarra, there's a wonderful little street called Petticoat Lane that sort of kept a bit of the cobblestone street, and it's got a couple of little cottages there, one being a Wilson's cottage and maybe a Sharam cottage, I forget the names. And one of them, has the history there of where, 12, a family of 12 living in about 3 small rooms. It's hard to fathom with what society's like today, and the conditions that they lived and worked in those days. A lot simpler life, right? Like, geez, it'd be nice to get some of those elements back, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I suppose you could cherry pick some of them, but I think about just the sheer laundry and having to do it by hand and thinking like, oh, you're having 12 kids. Like, how in the world? Fascinating. I mean, I feel like we could spend the entire podcast just talking about this history, and to be born into a family legacy like that, I cannot even comprehend. But tell me about, what was your first memory of wine growing up? When did you kind of clock it as, oh, this is something that our family does?
It's probably one that's not. It's probably one that's a little bit funny in that my birthday is April the 4th, and so that is smack bang in the middle of vintage just about every year here in Coonawarra. And so my memories are that I always used to have a shared birthday party with a friend who also lived in Coonawarra. He was a year older than me, and our birthdays were only 4 days apart because Mum and Dad were so busy that didn't have time to organise birthday parties for me. So I always just jumped on the tailcoats of my friends' birthday parties each year. So I guess you as a young kid, you realise that March and April was a busy time, and you didn't have time to. You didn't have, I guess, your undivided parents' attention because they were quite busy with vintage.
Yeah, well, I suppose it's unfortunate, but I imagine that, you probably got to run amok with your mate, which is pretty cool, rather than both celebrating together.
Yeah, and I mean, interestingly, there's a store, the general store in Coonawarra, and it's got a lot of stories about the general store, but it's got a bottle shop and a post office, and you can go and buy your pies and pasties and soft drinks and salad rolls and whatever there. And in my birthday being in the middle of vintage, when I finished school, I went and worked at the Rouge Home Winery for a vintage, and I was on night shift, and I turned 18 that morning. So my 18th birthday, I worked night shift, finished at 9 o'clock in the morning, went to the Coonawarra store, grabbed a long neck of Cooper's Pale Ale and got a bacon and egg sandwich, and that was my celebrating my 18th birthday. A long neck and a bacon egg sandwich, and then home for a sleep and back to work that night.
So humble, but also I kind of love it because it says a lot about who you are. You're a simple man, a bacon and egg roll and a long neck, and you're a happy guy.
Well, there wasn't much choice when you finish at 9 a.m. So, look, it's I think that, there's other memories as well. I remember pottering around. There was always the Easter egg hunts in the winery. I remember one being in a drain and I couldn't get my hand in there. It was too big, and I just started crying because I couldn't get to this Easter egg. I remember being a boy, and you knock on the tanks and they were empty or full, and I remember knocking on one going, yeah, this must be empty, and then opening the racking valve and the wine just coming out and just pushing, like it came out with such force it just knocked me over, wine going all down the winery. And there's photos of home and me getting a lift home on the back of the ute just covered head to toe in red wine, and Mum and Dad laughing at me. So, there's fond, funny memories of, little kids being silly in the winery, right?
Goodness, great. Well, I'm glad they had a bit of a sense of humour. But I want to talk a little bit about your experience and when you decided that, winemaking was for you. I think a lot of people go through their adolescence and into their early adult years with lots of dreams and hopes. Did you know that you want to be a winemaker, or what? How did you kind of come to that conclusive decision?
Yeah, I was sort of always relatively interested in coming back and being a winemaker. It was something for me that was on the radar. It took, I finished school and then went and worked at Rouge Homme for a vintage and travelled overseas and mucked around, and then did another vintage and travelled overseas and mucked around, and then Dad sort of gave me the slight push and said, "Well, you've been out of school for a couple of years now. You can't just keep having gap year after gap year." And so I went up to Wagga Wagga and I must have had 3 years. I went up, worked at Tabilk as well, and then went overseas, and then came back and went to uni after I did a vintage in the US in Sonoma Valley. So then went to uni, and it was something that I just enjoyed. I enjoyed the lifestyle. I enjoy wine. It was something that I always wanted to do and just thought I would do. I guess it's an interesting. It's something that just the lifestyle of Coonawarra is something that I've just really loved forever. I go to the city and I go and, you pour wine and go and eat at restaurants and talk wine and go to the footy and do all those things that you get to do in the city. But I always really enjoy leaving and coming back here to Coonawarra and in the slower pace, and the really lovely community we have here is one that I've enjoyed. So that was sort of a big part of wanting to be a winemaker as well.
Can't imagine, being at university and being a Redman, did that help with the ladies? Like when you go and you're like at a party and you're like, my name's Dan Redman, my family's like, pretty big in wine. Like, does that help?
Oh, no, I was in Wagga Wagga. Not many people drink wine, and there was Casellas there and Calabrias and so, there was a bit of Griffith community there, and they sort of vaguely knew who I was. But, it was Wagga Wagga was a nice, humbling experience in that it was sort of far-reached, and it didn't, that the wine school is a very small part of the whole university. And I keep in contact with a few of the winemakers from afar, but my friends were actually sort of school teachers and nurses and vets and different groups of people that I ended up keeping in touch with, probably more so than the wine community.
Well, that's always good. It's always good to have friends in different places. You never know when you're going to need the expert opinion of a vet, that's for sure. I want to talk a bit about Rouge Homme, because if, the listeners that don't know a little bit about that story and that name, can you give us a bit of a rundown of Owen and Edna and how they kind of changed and played a part in the Redman story?
Yeah, I guess sort of we sort of got up to the 40s and 50s, and around that time in the 50s, there was a wine critic at the time called Rudy something, and I forget his last name. It's a little bit obscure. And I think he was actually a lawyer from Sydney, and he made his way to Adelaide maybe to do a wine show or something, and then came down to Coonawarra, and he saw Bill and Owen and Owen's younger brother Don at the winery, and said, right, I want to taste some of your wines. And they said, well, we don't have any. They were essentially sort of making us bulk wine, and they'd sell their little bit off to Woodley's, and they'd sell their bit off to Penfolds, and they'd sell their little bit off to Lindemans, and sort of all the wine was gone. And he said, well, I've just travelled all this way from Sydney essentially to taste some wines, and there wasn't any there. He said, well, you should start up your own label, keep a little bit of that back and set up your own label. And that was sort of when the Rouge Homme name came up, a very literal French, red man name. And so they started that in the early 50s, and then by the mid-60s, along that time, they'd actually been buying. Coonawarra has a lot of soldier settler blocks, and they were buying up soldier settler blocks and developing them for companies such as Mildara and Penfolds and a few others. And then Lindemann said, oh, you're doing that for other companies, why don't you do it for us? And they said, oh, no, there's too much hard work and not enough money in it. And they said, oh, can we buy the Rouge Homme winery and brand and everything associated with it, and they put a price on it that they didn't think would be accepted, and it was accepted straight away. So the Rouge Homme brand was started in 1952 and sold in 1965. So didn't have it for a very long time, and that allowed Bill to retire. Don moved with his wife and 3 girls up to Adelaide. In a strange way, his grandson is now owns quite a few pubs and restaurants in Adelaide now. Is in that side, the retail side of things, and Grandpa decided he wanted to still make wine, so he bought Arthur Hoffman's block vineyard and started up the Redman label in 1966. So it was around that time that Owen and Edna, that was when they sort of started the label and really sort of, I guess, put Redman on the map by doing, you know, the old school way, Shanteh. They pounded the pavement and went and poured wine in bottle shops and you know, reached out to the wine world, you know, via pouring wines and being visible. And hence, you know, your father had it in his cellar, and that's a story that we hear a lot, and it's something that we are trying to make sure that the next generation and the generation that follows still sees Redmans in their cellar and realises that some of those older wines are drinking well, but some of our younger wines are pretty good as well. So that's something that we've got to work on, is keeping that recognition going.
Well, I mean, it's probably one of the most iconic labels, I think, in Australian wine, you know, that iconic canary yellow, and that's probably not the name of it, but it is iconic. And I think that, you know, you see a bottle and it's familiar to a lot of people. But I think it's so interesting that Rouge Homme kind of ran its course at that time, because I think that, you know, if you look at all of Australian wine and our clarets and our red burgundies and Mosel whites or whatever we used to call it, that would have had, if that had stayed in the Redman family, that Rouge Homme, you know, the rights to it, you would have changed it anyway, wouldn't it? You would have gone back to owning Redman and being a proud Australian and not trying to emulate something that's French. But it's interesting that it just kind of ran its course in that time.
Yeah, I guess Rouge Homme sort of died off. No, it ended up being bought out in corporate world, South Corp and then Foster's and Treasury and whatever else. So, but it was quite iconic through quite a bit of time. I think it won a Jimmy Watson in 1993 or 4. I think it was 93 once and 94. But interestingly, when they came up with the name, they sort of said Redman, and someone said, no, you can't use your name. So then Don's wife came up with Rouge Homme as something else, and it's interesting. The whole French influence is an interesting part of the whole wine industry, isn't it? And I think, you know, seeing that now, and I think seeing the rise of other varieties from other countries is quite an interesting part of the whole wine industry now, isn't it? Where you're seeing some expressions of Italian varieties and Portuguese varieties coming to the fore in the industry, which is quite interesting.
Mm. Yeah, it definitely tells a part of the wonderful tale that is your family legacy, and I, you know, I think that those bottles, you know, they're just gorgeous to look at, and I'm glad that it's part of the story. But I mean, not a lot of people know so much about their family lineage. What does it mean to you to kind of have such ties to such an important family within the region? Are you conscious of that when you wake up and go to work every day, or?
No, I would. Well, I mean, to a certain degree, you do, because, you know, we drive in and see this architecturally designed winery that was built in the 60s and has that, very much has that 70s feel. So you sort of, I guess you do get a bit of that throwback of when you drive in. But it's something that It's something that often you forget, and sometimes your customers, remind you of that. And there's one customer that sort of bought a fair bit of wine over the years, and he sort of every now and then he'll just write in an email and just say, "Oh, just remember, if there wasn't a Redmans, there's not a Coonawarra." And that's sort of, if you sort of look back in the history, there's a chance that winemaking would have stopped and might not have gone through, and we don't have Coonawarra as it is now. But there's, I think, there's only so long you can just keep looking back as well, though, Shanteh. So you don't forget it, and it is a part of our story. It's the crucial part of our story is our history, and but we've got to just keep making sure that we're telling it and letting new people know that this is a pretty incredible story. The other thing that reminds you as well is in our cellar door that we've got a big picture that goes from ceiling to, it's not a huge ceiling, but ceiling to floor, and it's a picture of Bill Redman pouring wine to Don and Owen in an underground cellar. So, just about daily when you've got customers in serving them that you do talk about Bill and Owen. So it just about is a daily reminder of it happening.
I'm sure that they would be thrilled with that too. I want to talk a little bit about enduring reds, which is something, a couple of words that we don't hear as much these days. With people and our flavours changing, I often wonder if who is cellaring wines and who's going to continue doing that, and the appreciation of that for the palates of the future. Tell me a little bit about the importance of making wines that will last the test of time.
So when Grandpa Owen would sell wine, that he'd sell a dozen, so buy a dozen and don't touch them for 2 years at least. And so that's something that we want to respect with the way we're making our wines, and even our Shiraz at cellar door it's $22.50. We can confidently say you can put this down for 5 to 10 years and pull it out and drink it. I guess these days it's finding the balance of most of the wine's consumed as a young wine, and it's finding as young wines. So it's finding that balance of being able to be consumed now as a young wine, but also we still like that it has the structure and balance and acidity that allows it to have a bit of time in bottle. I actually have just read the WBM magazine article with Jess Hill-Smith talking about Yalumba in 175 years, and she said, her comment was a lot of friends haven't drank old wines, and so we have 10 years ago started up holding some wine back and releasing it with that age on it, and it's becoming very increasingly more popular on our sales is people buying our 9 to 8, 9, 10-year-old Shiraz and Cabernet. It just has that little bit of time to in bottle. So it's how we educate that and get that through. It's hard, but I guess having the stock there to be able to do that rather than tell people to leave it is a good start to be able to do that and encourage that with wine.
I think that you've hit the nail on the head, because it is all about what people like to drink and their differing palates. And I think that, if you like to drink young reds when they're crunchy and full of vibrant fruit, then that's absolutely available. And like you said, you can offer them that. But if you have a palate that's a bit more adventurous and you want to explore kind of the change and the adventure that wine can go on, then like you said, it's available to them as well. And, recently you celebrated 50 years of making Cabernet. And if there's ever a great variety that tells a tale over time, it's Cabernet. And I always probably like to harp on a little bit more about Cabernet in the last maybe 5 years of my career, just because I felt like there wasn't enough young people talking about how amazing Cabernet is. And so, for me, it's definitely a love affair. And, I think, like you said, there's a place for all types of wine, and it's important that you're able to offer people something at cellar door, which you do. But But like you said, it's about communication and having access to these amazing wines like you guys make and keep, which, we appreciate.
Yeah, and Cabernet's an interesting one, isn't it? Like it's I think the troubling part with Cabernet is that probably a lot of people have drank a bad Cabernet, and I think bad Cabernet is as bad as you can get. If you've got those green, astringent wines, you're not going to go back to it, are you? You just go, no, I don't like Cabernet, and most people don't have. Most people just try it and go, no, I like it or I don't like it. It's not so much of having that knowledge of wine. So hopefully means that people now are trying some good Cabernet and want to drink it. I think we're lucky we've got some good people in the industry sort of heroing Cabernet and flying the flag, down here in Coonawarra and over in Margaret River and through Victoria. So hopefully that means that we can sort of get Cabernet right back on the agenda of people saying this is the drink, let's get back to it.
And I think that if you want to know of winemakers that fully believe in what they do, go to a winery that makes an imperial, a 6-litre bottle, because that sure is confidence in the product. And I when I saw that, I just hats off to you. I was very, very impressed, and I thought this is. I love this.
Yeah, and we opened one last year, 1993, for a dinner here at the winery, and it opened up beautifully. 20 years old, and it was singing. And interestingly, we were only making 5 or 6 years ago. We were only making 20 or 30, and somehow we just had a bit of demand build up, and we started selling out within a few months of release, and we were releasing them before we'd even released our current release. It was younger than our current release Cabernet, and so then we've made up to 50 and sold out in about 6 or 7 months, and in 2021 we bottled 100 of them, and we've sold over 50, and there's just crazily there's an amazing demand for it, and it's but they're quite fun to open and drink. Like they're good fun if you get the right occasion and the right people there. It's a good fun evening or day.
Oh, I often get people asking me, family and friends, someone's got an important occasion, what are they buying? I'm like, $450, buy an imperial 6-litre Cabernet for the rest of their lives. Like, that is money well spent. I wish someone would do that for me. That's a hint to anybody who wants to buy me a nice gift. But I'd like to also talk a little bit about what the future looks like for Redman. What does climate change look like for in Coonawarra, and what does that mean for you guys?
Yeah, so I guess if you just go, we'll just touch on the Coonawarra and the climate. We're pretty lucky here in Coonawarra, having a pretty stable climate. We're very fortunate that we've got underground water, so we've got an amazing resource there to irrigate our vineyards when and if they need it. We're only 60 kilometres to the coast, so we sort of get a bit of that coastal influence without it totally being coastal influence. So we're in a really positive spot for decades to come with Coonawarra. We have handwritten records of Grandpa's handwritten records from 1970 through to Dad's handwritten records. He's still doing them, even though I've tried to computerize them in the last few years. So what we've seen, Shanteh, is that the picking dates have stayed pretty similar. You don't tend to pick much after Anzac Day. That's when the season breaks and your days are short and your weather's cooler. So you always sort of have to make sure that you start your picking in time to finish before sort of Anzac Day, as a bit of an old rule. But our picking dates have stayed very similar. But what we've found is we're we're a couple of Beaumay further ahead than what Grandpa was back in the 70s. So, he'd start in the middle of March for Shiraz, and he was picking at, 9, maybe 10 Beaumay. Now we're picking in the middle of March, and, we had some fruit come off this year off one particular vineyard, and second or third week in March at 15 Beaumay. So you're talking, it's quite significant how much riper that is than what Grandpa had back in the 70s. So we have got a warmer climate, but we're still pretty lucky in that it's not going to be to the extreme in that front. Coonawarra, Redmond's. Look, I think it's an interesting tale. I guess we have just. I think we're going to keep. Well, no, not we're going. We're going to keep doing what we do, and that's Shiraz and Cabernet. That's what Coonawarra does best. How that. That will be in different forms of blends and standalone wines and single vineyards, which we do a few of anyway. So that will still be trying to hero those vineyards and those wines. But I do see a future in Coonawarra for some other varieties, and it'll be interesting to see there. I have heard of really small bits and pieces of some different white varieties going to be planted and some other red varieties in the region. So it'll be interesting to see in the next sort of 4 to 5, 10 years what happens out of the region, being a region that is 60% Cabernet. So it'll be interesting. There'll be a little bit of change in a very conservative area, right?
Yeah, watch this space. I think that there's already a lot happening in Coonawarra, and there's change and there's adaptation, but there's also, people doing like yourselves what you really have done so well. And that is great, because we do not want to see somebody flipping the script completely and forgetting what the soul of their brand is. So I thought I'd ask, big question, but maybe you can answer it in one word, who knows. What are the attributes of a great winemaker? And when you are done with your tenure and you put your feet up on your veranda one day and let, someone else take over, what do you want to be known for in your time at Redmond's?
Like anyone can just get some grapes and squash them and ferment them and make a wine, but you've got to be diligent with what goes on when you pick and how you do it. So you've got to have the passion to want to be a winemaker. For me, how do I want to be remembered? Geez, it's not something that I really think about that much. Hopefully it's just someone who's carried on and improved from what I've learnt from my father, who learnt from his father, and my uncle as well, Mal. Hopefully I've learnt and improved from what they've been doing. There's no point standing still and not moving with the times. And, little things. Dad and Mal brought in, the cooling in the 80s. It sounds pretty basic these days, but it dramatically improved how the wines and ferments happen. So there's just little things that hopefully it means that I've improved Redmond's along the way.
Well, I certainly think you're a good lister, and you're a good person to have reflected on the past and the future. You are president of Coonawarra Vignerons and somebody that is involved in their community, a bit like Edna, who won an OAM for her community work. So I think that you are definitely taking it, taking the reins, moving forward in a very progressive but also positive step. So I think Redmond's in very good hands with you and your brother. I'd like to know, if you could only drink 3 drinks for the rest of your life, what would they be and why?
3 drinks. You'd need something a bit refreshing. I love a Cooper's Pale Ale, so I need a few of those along the way. I don't think they could all be alcoholic, so you just a little bit of water to make sure you stay hydrated, and then. If you could just make sure you had a mixed dozen of whites and reds or sparkling there somewhere would work quite well, wouldn't it?
I like that. A mixed dozen, yeah. That's playing it safe, but I appreciate it because you don't want to back yourself into a hole there and then, luckily this is, not written in stone. But Dan, it's been such a pleasure getting to know a bit more about you, hearing your incredible family story, and there's so much more to cover, so we might have to pick up this chat another time or talk to somebody else in the Redman family. But thanks for joining me today, and I look forward to the next time we have a chat. Thanks,
Shanteh. Appreciate it, and keep up your wonderful work there of talking to great people in our industry.
Cheers to you. This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Stay tuned for more stories from the world of wine and drinks. Listen in every Thursday on your podcast app. Follow us on Instagram @overaglasspod and contact us at overaglass@deepintheweeds.com.au.